I need to start this lesson off with a big disclaimer. I don't really use material design that much, really at all. There have been times when I've used the floating action button, or the FAB, as some people call it, as well as some of the dimensional shadows, but that's really the two main design things that I've lifted from the guidelines to really just kind of use it as a style, not necessarily an entire system. And the simple reason for that is that I've been an iOS guy for the last decade, since 2007, 2008, and I've never personally owned an Android phone, except for a brief 1 week stint when I was playing around with the Google Pixel, which was cool and all, but I decided that I just couldn't bring myself to make the switch. The primary reason that I've used material design as a reference in the past has been for converting original iOS designs into Android-based designs. If you are designing specifically for Android and the developer or development team that you're working with is coding native Android apps, then you should definitely consult the material design guidelines and become as familiar with them as possible. Even if you're not designing specifically for Android right now, it's definitely worth taking a look at the material guidelines, reading through them anyways. There is some really good stuff in there. The component section here is probably the most relevant for understanding the individual design patterns. You've got, lots of different app bars, backdrops, and just kind of material language in general. Here's the floating action button, and kind of going into these and just seeing how they are using them. What colors they're using, see how they add these floating action buttons to like a contact form. So there's definitely things that you can lift out of the guidelines here, even if you're not necessarily designing an Android specific app. There's very few times where I've just gone straight all Android or all material design and just didn't deviate at all. So there's a lot of good things that you can lift out of here just as some inspiration. There might be some good pickers or progress indicators, even the switches. You can design something like this and still have it on iOS if you're designing for iOS. So it's definitely worth kind of familiarizing yourself with this. So should you use the iOS human interface guidelines, or should you use the material design guidelines? This is kind of a loaded question, and it depends on your overall preference for different ecosystems. Again, it also depends on the goals of your project. I will say from experience, I've worked with a lot of different clients, big and small, designing their mobile apps, and every single one of them that was going to eventually put their app on both platforms always started with iOS and then kind of shoehorned it to fit into the Android system. One of the reasons is because iOS has always had a pretty rigid design system guideline, whereas Material has evolved over the years and changed a little bit. They used to have navigation that always stayed at the top, and then later they introduced the bottom tab bar navigation, whereas iOS always had the bottom tab bar navigation. But I mean, there's lots of things that Android has had for a long time that iOS is now just implementing. So there's definitely some ebb and flow and some give and take that you can use from both of those guidelines. Again, it really just depends on your preferences and your goals and the overall style you're going for. There is a case for hybrid apps as well. A lot of apps nowadays are built with web technologies that compile JavaScript into native iOS code and native Android code for certain parts of the application. Some might even have like a natively built shell, and then the content behind that shell is all piped in through a JavaScript framework. Using web technologies like that for a long time was kind of a lackluster experience because the performance just wasn't there. But now more and more web products are really making a lot of progress. Think about Figma designing in the browser, or all of the different Slack mobile apps. You're kind of replicating a lot of that native iOS, and you have the exact same experience on Android and iOS. So a lot of times you can deviate a little bit from the norm, from the guideline norm, and you can incorporate a little bit of iOS, a little bit of Material, and have that exact same experience on both platforms, on both iOS and Android. And that can be a case for the hybrid app. If you look at an app like Airbnb on both iOS and Android, it doesn't really have really strong ties to iOS or Android. It's kind of its own language, and it feels fluid between the two platforms. All right, so this is an example of the app Roadie. This is just kind of like a one small snippet of a style guide on a much larger app. And it's just kind of, showing all of the iOS style things. And this is some of the content view. And then I've got the kind of navigation bar up here, the tab bar down here, which is, the main navigation. But at the time, Android had more of a top bar navigation. So we had both actions and navigation up here at the top, whereas it was on the bottom with iOS. So I kind of ported this navigation into the Android style, and we changed the type to Roboto from, I think we used Avenir on this one, which is one of the standard fonts in iOS. And this is another example of an iOS app. We started this Steady app with iOS design. So we've got these onboarding screens. First time UX, you got your zip code, and then all the different screens, just kind of looking through all of these. Very iOS with the navigational kind of bar at the top. And then down here, you can see we start to add in the navigation right here, this little tab bar down at the bottom. And then if you look at the Android screens, it's kind of the same screen, but it's definitely more in the Android style. At least, a few years ago, it was very standard to have this type of header with the logo in the top with Android. And really the only way that I was able to do this was I would go in and I would look at material guidelines and I would look at how they're handling certain components and try to match that with what I had already designed with iOS. So basically using the same thing, but bringing in more of the standard Android components. They've even changed their input fields a little bit more since this project. And then the kind of dashboard. So I'm still bringing in this tab bar because from the Roadie project to this one, they did update the guidelines where they were using a bottom navigation. So that still made sense. But you can see a lot of the buttons are a little more hard edge, whereas iOS has a lot more rounded rectangles. This one has a little bit tighter. Obviously, the keyboard is slightly different, and also I like to use this 360 by 640. I think it's like the medium DPI size for Android. So it's like 15 pixels wider. It's not quite as tall as like an iPhone, but it just kind of depends on the main device that is active for that time period. And also the device that you have that you can mirror to. So kind of going back in, I'm keeping a lot of those elements. If you look at this background check on the iOS app, I'm just going to copy and paste it beside this one. You can kind of see the differences here. Obviously there's a new status bar because it's not the same. We're changing the type from San Francisco to Roboto, and I'm changing the corner radius. In material design, they have this progress bar indicator that is kind of a standard component in material, whereas I was just going to have this kind of little really thin kind of iOS looking progress bar up here, but I could have technically chosen to put that on the Android. But also if you have the ability to use standard components, then you can definitely do that, and it's going to save a little bit of development time. So I'm just kind of picking and choosing a few different very specific Android type components where I've got checkboxes and things like that to just make it feel a little bit more native Android. So just like for iOS, the best way to design for Android is going to be have an Android phone and use it, become familiar with the patterns, and you learn a lot more about what happens in certain scenarios. I myself, like I said, I haven't had an Android phone. I've always been an iPhone user, so I have to kind of make do with referencing material guidelines. Sometimes if there's a big project and there really needs to be very specific Android type design patterns and experiences and flows, I will kind of rope in someone I know that is very familiar with Android and just ask them questions like, okay, when you tap this and when you change the filter and the custom date picker and whatever questions you might have, it's always good to go ask someone who is really familiar with it. The same way that you can ask a front-end developer about responsive code, you can ask an Android user about how they handle certain things, and that will inform your designs a little bit better. But all in all, I would definitely encourage you to go into the material guidelines and read through them, because that's going to be really the best way to kind of understand all of the different patterns apart from actually being an Android user. So for material design homework, I want you to take the iOS designs that you did for the Hey email app, and I want you to redesign them with the material guidelines. So we're going to change out the fonts. We might change out the rounded rectangles, change up the status bar and the sizing of the artboard itself. And we might even add the floating action button to write an email versus having an action button in the top right or wherever else you might have put it. So just do a simple experiment converting the iOS designs into more of a material style. You don't have to go all out and design this huge app, but just kind of enough to get into the rhythm and the routine of changing those patterns from iOS to more in the Android world. So good luck with that, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.